Welcome back. Up now we have Ivan, and he will be speaking to us about a Kubernetes extension for VS Code. Let's make him feel welcome.
In the beginning was the command line. All things were made by the command line, and without it was not anything made that was made. And the command line shineth in the engineering department, and the engineering department comprehendeth it not. Good afternoon, my name is Ivan Towlson. I work for Microsoft on the team that develops Helm, Brigade, CNAB, basically open source tools around the container ecosystem. I bring to you the distinction of being, I think, probably the only person to present on a Windows laptop at a Linux conference. Tell me if I'm wrong. What I've been working on for a while now is an extension to Visual Studio Code that brings some of that Kubernetes experience into some of that tooling experience for Kubernetes into your editor. Why do we do this? Well, because we are told all the time, developers love the command line. We're elite hackers in our hoodies, and we're sitting there at our green screens rattling out these command lines and putting them together into bash scripts, and everything's great. Command lines are very powerful, they're very composable. They are something which, once you know how to use them, you can become very, very adept, very, very productive with them. But here's a vital statistic that I just made up. There are, funnily enough, developers out there who are not aficionados of the command line. And we talk about the command line as a single monolithic thing, and it isn't. You may be very proficient at using, say, kubectl because you've learned so much of that. You may be very proficient with the 4 or 5 kubectl commands you use all the time, and yet every time you use Helm, maybe you have to look things up. I don't know. But there are many developers who are not that confident. They've grown up with GUIs, they're more familiar with GUIs, or they've not got the depth of experience with certain tools that allows them to be productive with command lines in the way that somebody more experienced can be. Different people have got different experiences. And for some of those people, a GUI gives them benefits such as discoverability. It is easier to find things in a GUI than it is in many command lines. I recall my early experience with Git, which admittedly is an outlier in so many ways. I could not get my head around Git. I could not do it. So I ended up using GUI clients that made Git look like Subversion because I understood Subversion. And for the longest time I used Git that way until gradually, bit by bit, I began to figure out, oh, well, there's all these other things that it can do. I can begin to form a mental model. And actually now I'm kind of half and half between I use the GUI for some things, the command line for others. I'm mixing and matching. Finding out those features via the discoverability of things like TortoiseGit or GitKraken or SourceTree or whatever actually really helped me with that. Visualization is something that GUIs do well. In Kubernetes, we've got, for example, the dashboard, which allows you to get a quick view of the resources in your cluster. In Git, we've got Git-K, which allows you to see a graphical tree of how your repository hangs together. And there's context awareness. If you're in a command line, there's a limited amount of context that it's got. It's got, for example, what your current working directory is, maybe got some history, things like that. But if you're in a GUI, you might have, for example, your project files loaded, and your tooling can look more at, for example, what files you've got open, not just what files are there in the directory, but what are you actually working on at the moment? What's in front of your face right at this very minute? And this is a quote from Brendan Burns, one of the developers, one of the originators of Kubernetes. This is about democratizing the Kubernetes experience, democratizing distributed systems. Kubernetes is a platform for that, but kubectl is not necessarily the be-all and end-all of that experience. So the reality is, you don't live only on the command line. You live in your editor. And so you don't necessarily want to be using Kubernetes only from the command line. It's nice for many of us to have the Kubernetes experience available to us in our editors too. And that comes with one kind of minor but important condition. Don't let me stop you writing this sort of thing for other editors, but this is the only one that I've done. And that's a link to the Visual Studio Code Marketplace. If you're a VS Code user, you can go to that link. It will take you to the extension that I've been working on in the marketplace. You can install it in VS Code, and it will hook up to your kube config, and you should be good to go. So the extension that I've been working on, it is firstly, it's fully open source. So let me bring up, that's the GitHub repo. You can see we've got an ever-increasing, depressingly increasing number of issues against us. I've got some pull requests I've not got round to yet. The whole shame of the whole thing is right there to be beheld. The source code is actually even more shameful than the issue queue. It works with any Kubernetes. I am a Microsoft employee. It's under an Azure repo, but there are no, there's nothing that sort of binds it to Azure or to Google Cloud Platform or to any particular implementation of Kubernetes. It's all done under the surface using things like kubectl and the Kubernetes node JavaScript client library. So it's all using the standard Kubernetes mechanisms. There are no cloud-specific components apart from a few bits that relate to provisioning. So for example, there's a feature in there where you can create a cluster or you can locate a cluster in your cloud or on your local disk or whatever and add it to your kube config. And those obviously do have some cloud-specific bits. I'm gradually making those more plug-in based, so it's sort of a platform and people can add their own clouds or whatever to it. But there are some bits in there that are specific to clouds in that regard. But apart from that, it is not cloud-specific. It will work with GCP, it will work with EKS, it will work with AKS, it will work with bare metal Kubernetes, it will work with Kind, it will work with Minikube, it will work with microkates, whatever. If it doesn't, it's a bug, add it to the list of shame. So what does it give you? Why would you use this rather than rattling out the kubectl commands? Well, as we talked about before, it's context aware. It knows, for example, what files you're working with at the moment. It can use that information to kind of guide what it's doing. For example, if you do a kubectl create or a create command from within the extension, it will see, have you got a Kubernetes YAML file open? If so, I'll create a resource from that YAML file. I'll create the thing that you're working with, rather than you having to say, well, that file, the one I just had open in Vim or whatever. It's version aware, and this is useful if you're working with, particularly if you've got a largish range of Kubernetes versions in play. There is an option there where it will use the appropriate version of kubectl for each of your clusters. It will look at the version, figure out what's the right version to use, download that version of kubectl and use that, and switch between them as you switch between clusters. It's toolchain aware. It is not purely a wrapper around kubectl. It knows about Docker, it knows about Builder, it knows about Git, it knows about Helm, and it can use these to kind of encapsulate more common workflows. It's aware of some of those tasks that you carry out at a higher level than those individual commands that you issue. So let's have a look. One of the features that is most visible and which people seem to get a lot of value out of is a very simple one, which is just visual cluster browsing within VS Code. Now, I haven't figured out how to make this font size on this side a little bit bigger, so I'm afraid you may have to bear with me just a bit. You may have to squint or move up to the front. So here, for example, we can see we've got a cluster that I created for this. We can look at, for example, the namespaces or the nodes within it. I can go looking at deployments. My deployments will contain pods. They'll contain pods. My deployments don't contain pods. Why do they not contain pods? Oh dear. This is going well. It was going so well when it was in PowerPoint. There we go. My deployments. My deployments contain pods. Right. There we go. So now you can see how rapid and reliable the thing is. Sorry, I think there's probably some caching going on there. I sometimes need to refresh the thing. So you can kind of easily find your way around your cluster using that thing. As you can see, you can also click on one of these things and easily view the YAML for it. But that's kind of a beginning step. That's a very kind of just, well, I'm looking around and I can do that using the dashboard. What more can I do? Well, as a developer, you've got a fairly simple development loop. I'm working on something, I want to deploy it to my test cluster. I want it to go there in something, so maybe a debugging configuration. I'd like to have a port so that I can hit it, for example, or I need to forward a port so I can get into the pod and get a terminal on the pod and clean it all when I'm done. There's a bunch of those tasks that kind of fit together. For example, here I've got a piece of code that I've been working on. Does anybody here reticulate splines for a living? No, just amateur reticulators? Okay. So this is, and I know Microsoft won't want me showing you this, but this is part of the Azure code. And I would like to deploy this to my Kubernetes cluster. But all I've got here is a JavaScript file and a Docker file to say how I want it to be put together. What I can do with this is I can go Kubernetes run, and it will build using the Docker file. It will, when it thinks about it, it's pushing that over the very powerful conference Wi-Fi. It's pushing that image to, oh, come on, conference Wi-Fi. This is a network-heavy demo, so if this all goes south, then I don't know where we're going to be. So that's what that is doing. There we go. It's pushed, and now it's done the kubectl run to create that. So if I now do a refresh on my cluster, I should see that I've now got this linux.conf.au demo workspace deployment that is running that piece of code. I've got options in there for doing that in a debugging configuration, and I can also expose that service. Oh no, okay, I've not given it a port, not to worry. So I've got commands for exposing services and for terminaling into that. So if I go into this pod, I can right-click here, ask for a terminal on that, and you can see coming up in there, I can do a list within that, and I'm now within that pod, within that container. and can do whatever I need to do within there. Obviously, one useful thing to be able to do with these things is to get logs out of them, because it's useful to be able to see what's going on in your pods. Yeah, you've seen how badly I made a mess of that. So what I can do is I can again right-click here, and I can either follow or show logs. If I do say follow logs, then it's going to do just kubectl logs. Notice I've not had to do anything like copying the name or anything like that. I'm just able to right-click where I'm looking around. I'm going, well, hang on, this has got a red icon. Why is that? What's going on there? Well, partly it's because it was, when I refreshed it was still creating. But you can see I've got those logs coming up in my terminal there. And it helps you work with YAML. How many people love YAML? Oh, okay. Right, well, I will hope to make you love it or at least hate it slightly less. So one of the things that we can do, and again, this sort of ties in with the version awareness, we've got schema information, for example, coming down from the cluster via the Kubernetes Swagger interface. And I can use that to, for example, to get information like what is, I don't know, what's the last probe time? It's the last time we probed something. How about that? Who would have guessed? What are toleration seconds? So you can kind of just hover over things to get hints on them. And that also turns into, we can grab this thing, for example, and I can go, let's see. So I can get prompts so that I can I can construct YAML, and there are also snippets for helping me to do that. So we've got that kind of IntelliSense, that kind of code completion feature available to us. And once we've got some YAML put together, we can very easily deploy it. As I mentioned earlier, I can do a Kubernetes create, and that will just deploy that YAML to the cluster, which you can see I've got a cron hello, and I might even have some jobs coming off that. I'm not sure yet. Not yet. And one of those workflow features is looking at synchronization and differences. If I've got a local YAML file, is it up to date with what's on the cluster? What are the differences? What will change if I deploy this manifest? So, for example, if I go in, I saved that deployment earlier. Where did I do that? It was there, and that's the pod. I don't want to muck around with the pod. Let me find my deployment. Let's save that. So I can just save, that's taking YAML off the cluster, saving it to the local file system. There we go, I've got that. And let's bring that up to maybe 2 replicas, save that, Kubernetes apply. And that should be fetched. So that's going to fetch the current state of the manifest from the cluster, and now it's going to do a diff and say, do you want to apply the changes you can see in front of you? So you know what's changed, you know what you're getting. I can say, yes, go ahead and do that. We've also got some Helm support in there. So in the browser, we've got access to your Helm repos. And you can, for example, install those into your cluster. I got one that's going to work with this cluster, this somewhat elderly version. So, for example, I can do an install directly from the Helm repo, or I can do a fetch to bring it down locally and have it accessible to me for me to work on, for example, to edit the values or whatever. And you can also see Helm releases as part of your cluster overview down there. All right, so hopefully this sounds like a useful thing to have for you or for your team. But maybe you've got some really useful kubectl plugin that you or your team use all the time, or that you've built for yourself and you want to share that. You want to make that part of people's workflow. You've got some neat tool like an operator or, for example, OPA policies that you think would fit in great on that tree. You'd like to see it as part of your cluster. You've got this domain-specific operator. For example, we heard this morning about the Ceph operator or the Rook operators that's got some special operations on it that you might want to expose with its own menu commands rather than just being a generic, it's a thing. It's under custom resources. You've got a particular command, whether it's a kubectl command or a Helm command or whatever, that you use all the time because of the way that you work. You've got a particular cloud that you want to be able to provision from. Maybe it's something, maybe it's some sort of internal resource, or maybe you're using a platform that I've not written a provider for. Or you've got this super special set of conventions and steps that you've coded up in 4,361 lines of bash, and your entire workflow depends on it. Now, we accept pull requests, we really do, but if you send me a pull request of 400,361 lines of bash, then it's going to take a lot of reviewing. I don't scale that well. So, how can we approach this? Well, it is your world, it is your editor, it is your Kubernetes cluster, it is your team, it is your tools, you know your industry, you know your workflows, you know your project layouts, you know your conventions. You should be able to build your own extensions on top of this. You should be able to build extensions to Visual Studio Code that work with the Kubernetes extension and integrate seamlessly into it. And we can do that via an API that is exposed by the Kubernetes extension. So this is not part of the Visual Studio Code API. This is part of something that the Kubernetes extension offers that works alongside that. So when you build a VS Code extension, you can also invoke the Kubernetes extension API. And we've had a bunch of people who've already worked with this. This has been out for about 9 months now, something like that. Red Hat have got an OpenShift plugin that works with the Kubernetes extension. There's a Linkerd extension that will show service mesh stuff on the tree. There's a Weave scope extension that will sort of pop open a Weave scope view on resources. I've got something which is kind of in preview at the moment. It's sort of not ready for release yet, but does some security stuff using rakkess and kubectl-who-can. So you can like right-click and go, who's got access to this particular resource, or what can I do on this particular resource? The Windmill folks have got a plugin for their Tilt development environment, development workflow. Gardener, who've got a kind of provisioning and management thing, they've got something that plugs into the clouds view. And one of my projects at the moment is so there's already an open policy agent editor plugin. I've got one that shows policies within Kubernetes as part of the tree and makes it easy to deploy them just by thinking about policies rather than about config maps or whatever. And for logging, there's a tool called Stern that, again, I've got a kind of an in-progress extension for Stern on the way. And of course, whatever you folks come up with. And there are samples that go with that. There's a sample for running kubectl top against nodes or pods. There's a cluster provider for the kind Kubernetes in Docker local thing, and there's one that shows how to display information like the server version in the tree. And there's a link down there that will take you to some information about the API. It's also, there's documentation in the repo, which is Azure/VS Code Kubernetes tools, and there's a samples repo, which is a sibling of that one. So the way that we get started with this, what I'd like to do in the remaining time that I've got is just walk through how you would actually do something like this. And I'm going to do a really simple example, which is just to be able to right-click on a deployment and say, I want to expose this as an external service. Oops. So the way I'll start this is, it's a terrible name, isn't it? But to create a Visual Studio Code extension, use the Yeoman code generator. Again, this is all cross-platform, this is all VS Code, although this is showing in a Windows window, and although it's relying on the conference network, it's actually nothing to do with Windows at all. So this is just walking through the usual boilerplate for creating a VS Code extension. And that's just going to need to do a little bit of npm installing because even a baseline extension brings in a fair amount of stuff. Oops. There we go. So what's that given us? It's given us a bunch of boilerplate. It's given us the package.json. It's given us an extension. I've used TypeScript because I'm more comfortable with TypeScript. JavaScript is fine as well. The usual VS Code extension options will work here. And when you create a VS Code extension using YoCode, it gives you something that actually does something to start off with. It basically gives you an extension that's got one command called say hello, that when the user runs it, it prints hello world. So again, there's nothing Kubernetes in this so far. If I can just hit F5 or the equivalent debug key to run this, it will bring up, it will bring up a kind of test environment that is another VS Code window. And if I look in here, it hasn't worked. Why not? Because I've got an old version of VS Code. Right, let's just tell it that I don't need whatever the heck is in 141. Try that again. I'm going to need to. Now, are you going to do this for me this time? There we go. So that's just printed a little message. There's no Kubernetes in here yet. This is just proving that we can actually make an extension work. All right, so how do I get involved with the Kubernetes extension? Well, there's a couple of things I need to do. I'm going to need to specify that my extension depends on the Kubernetes extension, so that if somebody goes to the marketplace and installs my new expose extension, they won't get an error saying, well, hang on, I don't know where to put this thing. It will bring the main Kubernetes extension along with us. So I need to add an incantation to this package.json thing. And this is just a magic string that is in the documentation, and we just need to have it. The other thing that I will do, I don't technically have to, but in practice you probably will do, is to install a wrapper around the API that's exposed by the Kubernetes extension, just to make it a little bit easier to work with. You don't need to do this, it's just a JavaScript object, so it's not a necessity to have the wrapper library, but it does make things a little bit easier. So we go to terminal. All right, and the network gods have smiled upon us, so life's good. We'll just fix that typo. Right. Okay, so I don't want a hello world command, I want an expose command, so I'm going to call this, I'm going to say my command is kates.expose. And I'm going to give it a title. Now I also need to tell it where this is going to appear, and to have it appear as a right-click thing on that left-hand side, I need to put it in what they call a view/item/context, and that's going to be, so the command that I want to have appear is kates.expose, and I need a when clause to say when to do it. And this again is another incantation, I'm afraid. I'm going to say I want it to match, I want it to appear when what they call the context string of the selected item matches, and this is a special string that is defined in the documentation, and it's defined here. There we go. So it's a resource. So I want to do vs kubernetes.resource.deployment because I want to show deployment. So vs kubernetes this is a regular expression with dots in it within JSON, so you have to do all the escaping. Otherwise you get really weird errors. All right, so now let's get rid of that. We'll use our new command ID. And for the time being, again, I'm just going to make sure that things are actually hooked up correctly. So again, I'm going to just run that in the debugger. Now, if I go in here, I can have a look at my cluster, and I'm hoping to see a new command appearing on deployments. I'm hoping to see my cluster at all. I want to take a feedback survey. Thanks. You know how to time things, actually, you really do. All right. There's my deployments. Let's have a look at that. And so I've got an exposes external service command. If I click that, I've got it hooked up to my command handler. Life's good. All right. So let's now have let's make that actually do something real. And something we're going to have to think about is that when someone clicks a deployment, we're going to need to know which deployment they clicked on. Well, fortunately, VS Code commands have that built in. If it's a right-click thing, then it's going to send us the thing that was clicked as an argument to the callback. So I'm going to make a function. And that's now going to get given whatever it is. But what is it? I mean, what is a deployment? It's not something that's defined by VS Code. It must be something that's defined by the Kubernetes API. So we're going to have to ask the Kubernetes extension to decode it for us. And the way we do this is we're going to ask the Kubernetes extension for its API object. Now, it's possible that may fail because the Kubernetes extension isn't installed or there's a wrong version or something like that. So we always have to check if it's available. If it's not available, then we'll do some super elegant error handling that the user will absolutely know what to do with. Assuming that all is well, we'll go const treenode equals ce.api, and there's an API called resolve command target, which accepts a command target. So now we can again check that. So if it's not resolved, if the Kubernetes extension is going, I don't know, or the treenode.node type does not equal what we expect it to be. There we go. Then again with the spiffy error handling. But if all that's good, then we've got the name is going to be the treenode.name. That's the name of our deployment. So far, so good. Now, if I'm going to expose something, I need a port to expose it on. So let's get port equals 08. We'll just use the VS Code API for this. Window.show input box. And because that could be cancelled again. So now I can go, the command that I want to run is expose deployment name -- type equals load balancer -- port equals $port. And now I want to invoke that. Now I could use something like shell.js for that, but because we invoke kubectl a lot and because the Kubernetes extension does all this stuff about, for example, getting the right version of kubectl, I'm actually going to go via it for that. So I'm going to need to get another API. So const kubectl equals kates.extension.kubectl-v1, and I need to await that because all of those things are async. If not, kc.available return. And now I can go await kc.api.invoke command cmd, and that's going to get me a result of invoking that shell command. And if result, if not result, So this is an exit code and a standard error, or result.code does not equal 0. vscode.window.show information message. Oops. Show error message. Arg. I'm really hoping I don't have to debug this. Else we will show an information message exposed. All right. Okay, it's not reporting any problems, so I'm going to go ahead and run it. I'm told I've got 5 minutes left, so we might have time for the cluster view to come up. So just having a think. Just sending all those packets far away. There we go. Workloads, deployments. Let's try Nginx. We'll expose Nginx as an external service. We'll try it on port 80. And we think it's been exposed. All right, let's have a look. Let's go into the network section. Let's have a look in services. And there, freshly created, is our Nginx service. So I've been able to add a new command for my exotic workflow to the Kubernetes extension in about 10 minutes or so, 15 minutes. It's a simple example. It's a very simple example. The examples that you may come up with for your team or for your workflow are going to require more time, more thought, and more code. But I hope that gives you some idea of what you can achieve with relatively little effort when you're able to leverage what's already there. So there's the links, there's the samples, there's the documentation. Thank you very much for your time. We might have like a couple of minutes for questions. All right, thank you very much.
We've got about 3 minutes for questions, and then it's snack time.
Hey, I'm Alex. Just a quick question. How hard would it be to debug that code while you're writing it?
To debug the code, the extension code?
Yes. Are you able to walk through in the debugger? And
yeah, it's very, very simple. Let me show you. So suppose, for example, I was suspicious that my command line was not correct, or that there was something wrong in the result. So let me expose a deployment. Oh, actually, this is not going to work. Sorry, I can't actually make a mistake because my code is so good. But what I can do is add a breakpoint, and then we can. Oops, bear with me. We'll expose as external service. Work through there, and you can see it's so that sort of test instance of VS Code is running under a debugger. It's just a JavaScript module running under a debugger, and the instance where I was writing is hooked up as the debugging host. Okay.
One last question.
Okay. I've been tinkering a bit with VS Code on ARM, on AH64. Are there any
you've been tinkering with?
VS Code on AH64, so ARM64.
Oh.
Are there any native components to this extension?
That is an excellent question. I'm very glad you asked that question when we only have 30 seconds left, so I can spin out the clock. Well, firstly, it calls out to binaries. So obviously those binaries need to be the right ones. But if there's any kind of consternation about that, then So as long as shell.js can invoke those binaries, it should be okay. I know there is some native stuff within the VS Code itself, the VS Code API itself. But that again, if you've got VS Code and ARM64, that must be working. I would frankly have to go through the node modules directory to find out if there's stuff that is native. I think that there is not. But I wouldn't be surprised if something deep in the bowels of, say, one of the network components might be doing something native. If there are modules that you've got particular concerns about, then yeah, the trouble is it's node.js, so there's so many transitive dependencies that are pulled in that I honestly have no real way of knowing. If there's anything that, I mean, feel free to ping me. I'm on Twitter, or my email is up there. I'd be really happy to work through this with you and figure out if there's anything that we are using that's got a native dependency, and if so, what would be a viable alternative. In terms of the API surface that we expose, that's all JavaScript. There's no native dependencies there. It's only if I'm using something internally that's native that I've got to worry. But let's catch up and figure it out. Thank you very much.
Let's thank Ivan again.
Thank you.
It is now time for snacks.